A fishing boat drifted silently through the fog off the Massachusetts shore when a father made an unthinkable choice. Minutes later, a lone fisherman's routine night turned into a race against time. What unfolded in those dark waters would teach an entire community about the power of forgiveness. If this story touches your heart, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that remind us it's never too late for redemption. Cedar Bay had always been home to 8-year-old Linda and her father Mason. Their small house by the harbor held years of happy memories: weekend fishing trips, evening walks collecting seashells, and Mason's famous blueberry pancakes every Sunday morning. "Look, Dad," Linda called out, pointing to a pod of dolphins playing in the distance. They were on their weekly fishing trip, the morning sun warming their faces as Mason taught her to check the crab traps. "Good eye, sweetheart," Mason smiled, his weathered hands steady on the wheel. "You're becoming a real sailor." Linda beamed with pride, breathing in the salty air that had become as familiar as her father's voice. Life had a simple rhythm back then. Mason's fishing business provided enough, and their little family of 2 had found its balance after Linda's mother passed away years ago. The other fishermen's wives would bring casseroles, and the town looked after them in that quiet way small communities do. Everything changed the day Ruth walked into Thompson's diner where Mason had stopped for his usual coffee. She was different from the women in Cedar Bay. Elegant, sophisticated, with perfectly manicured nails and ambitious dreams that reached far beyond their fishing town. At first, Linda tried to be happy for her father. He smiled more, dressed better, seemed lighter somehow. Ruth brought color and excitement into their quiet life. The wedding was small but lovely, with the lighthouse standing witness and the whole town celebrating. But soon the colors began to fade. "Linda, how many times do I have to tell you about those wet boots?" Ruth's voice cut through the kitchen one morning, sharp as a filleting knife. "This isn't a fisherman's shack anymore." The changes came gradually, then all at once. The Sunday pancakes stopped. Mason worked longer hours, trying to meet Ruth's expectations for a better life. Their fishing trips became rare, then stopped altogether. "She needs discipline, Mason," Ruth would say, her lip curling slightly when Linda came home with sand in her hair or seashells in her pockets. "She's too wild, too. Common." Linda watched her father change, like a tide slowly pulling him away. His shoulders hunched more, his laughs became shorter, his eyes avoided hers when Ruth's criticism filled the air. The man who had taught her to navigate by stars seemed to be losing his own way. "I just want what's best for us," Mason would mumble when Linda asked why they didn't go fishing anymore. But us had become a different word, one that somehow excluded her. Ruth's complaints grew louder, her demands heavier. The house Linda had once loved became a battleground of whispered arguments and tense silences. She learned to make herself small, to avoid Ruth's critical gaze, to hold back tears that would only make things worse. "Really, Mason," Ruth's voice would carry through the floorboards at night. "How can you expect us to build a proper life with her dragging us down? She's just like her mother, common as dirt." One autumn evening, as fog rolled in from the sea, Linda overheard the conversation that would change everything. She sat at the top of the stairs, hugging her knees, as Ruth's ultimatum sliced through the air below. "It's me or her, Mason. Choose. I won't live like this anymore." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. When Mason finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but to Linda, it sounded like thunder. "What? What do you want me to do?" Ruth's answer came cold and clear as November rain. "Get rid of her. Tomorrow. Or I'm gone." In her room that night, Linda clutched her favorite seashell, the one her father had helped her find on her 7th birthday. Outside, the lighthouse beams swept across her window, regular as a heartbeat. She didn't know then that the next day would bring a choice that would echo through their lives like a storm bell over angry waters. The safe harbour of her childhood was about to face its darkest storm, and the father who had taught her to swim would soon become the very thing she needed to survive. The next evening arrived with an unsettling calm. Mason appeared in Linda's doorway, his silhouette strange against the fading light. "Let's go fishing," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just like old times." Linda's heart leaped for a moment. Maybe things would go back to normal. The evening boat rides they used to take, watching the sunset while her father told stories of his days at sea. But something in his voice made her pause. "Really?" She stood, carefully placing her favorite shell back on the windowsill. "Grab your yellow raincoat," Mason said, already turning away. "It gets cold out there." Ruth watched them leave, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. She stood at the window, arms crossed, as Mason helped Linda into their small fishing boat. The evening fog was rolling in early, thick and heavy, wrapping the world in grey shadows. The engines sputtered to life, and they pulled away from the safety of the harbour. Linda sat near the bow, watching the town's lights grow dimmer through the mist. Something felt wrong. Her father wasn't heading toward their usual spot where they would watch the sunset. Instead, he steered deeper into open water, where the swells grew larger and the fog thicker. "Dad?" Linda's voice quivered. "Where are we going?" Mason didn't answer. His knuckles were white on the wheel, his jaw clenched tight. The lighthouse beams swept across his face in steady rhythm, each flash revealing more tension in her father's features. "Dad? Please." Linda wrapped her arms around herself, the evening chill seeping through her coat. "Can we go back?" "I'm cold." The boat's engine suddenly fell silent. They drifted now, surrounded by fog and darkness. The only sounds were the slap of waves against the hull and Linda's increasingly rapid breathing. Mason stood motionless at the wheel, his shoulders shaking slightly. In the dim light, Linda could see tears streaming down his face. This wasn't her dad anymore. Not the man who had taught her to swim, who had held her through thunderstorms, who had promised to always protect her. This was someone else. Someone shaped by Ruth's manipulation and his own weakness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, finally turning to face his daughter. "God help me, I'm sorry." "Daddy?" The word came out as a plea, the way she used to call him during nightmares. But this nightmare was real. Mason moved toward her with terrible purpose. His hands, the same hands that had once braided her hair and bandaged her scraped knees, now reached for her with desperate strength. "No!" Linda scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The boat's edge pressed against her spine. "Please, Dad, don't!" "Forgive me," Mason choked out. Then he lifted her, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if fighting against himself. For one terrible moment, Linda hung suspended between the dark water and the foggy sky. She saw her father's face, tears streaming down his cheeks, mouth twisted in anguish. Then she was falling. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. The November water hit like thousands of icy needles, shocking her system. Linda plunged beneath the surface, the cold burning through her clothes, her skin, straight to her bones. She fought her way back up, gasping as her head broke the surface. The boat's engine roared to life. Through the spray and fog, she saw her father at the helm, facing away, shoulders shaking. "Dad!" Her scream echoed across the water. "Please, Dad!" But the boat was already moving away, becoming a shadow in the mist, then nothing at all. Linda treaded water, her limbs growing heavier with each passing second. The waves seemed to grow larger, each one threatening to push her under. The yellow raincoat that had once made her feel safe now pulled her down like lead. She managed to wrestle it off, watching it sink into the darkness below. Each wave seemed bigger than the last, the cold creeping deeper, numbing her fingers, her arms, her thoughts. "Help!" she called, her voice growing weaker. "Someone help!" But only the waves answered, each one seeming to whisper Ruth's words. Get rid of her. As her strength ebbed, Linda's mind drifted to happier times, her father teaching her to tie sailors' knots, his patient hands guiding hers. "Remember, sweetheart," he'd said, "a good knot can save your life at sea." Now, bobbing in the cruel November waters, those memories felt like they belonged to another life entirely. The darkness below seemed to reach up for her, promising an end to the cold, to the fear, to the pain of betrayal. What Linda couldn't know, as she struggled in the darkening waters, was that fate had stationed another boat nearby, one that would change everything. But for now, she was alone in the gathering darkness, a small figure in a vast sea, her father's betrayal as cold as the waters that threatened to claim her. Joe Matthews wasn't supposed to be out this late. His nets were empty, and his wife Margaret would be worrying. But 40 years on these waters had taught him to trust his instincts, and something kept him from turning toward harbour. The beam from Cedar Bay's lighthouse swept across his weathered face as he scanned the foggy darkness. A sound caught his attention, faint, almost lost in the wash of waves. Joe cut his engine, letting the Emily's Grace drift. There it was again, a voice, weak but desperate, carried on the wind. "Dear Lord," he whispered, swinging his spotlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the fog like a knife, searching the churning waters. Then he saw it, something small and dark against the waves. Not something. Someone. "Hold on!" His shout carried across the water as he turned his boat toward the struggling figure. The spotlight caught a glimpse of pale face and flailing arms before the swell dropped the child back into a trough. Joe's hands moved with the swift certainty of long experience, guiding his boat closer while being careful not to swamp the swimmer with his wake. Every second counted. He could see the child's movements growing weaker. "Stay with me!" he called out, already preparing his gaff hook. The figure disappeared again beneath the waves, then resurfaced, gasping. Joe edged his boat alongside, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Grab hold!" he commanded, extending the gaff hook toward the struggling child. A small hand reached up, catching the shaft. Joe's muscles strained as he pulled, fighting against the weight of waterlogged clothes and the sea's reluctance to give up its prey. With one final heave, he hauled the child over the gunwale. She collapsed on his deck. A young girl, no more than 8 or 9, her lips blue with cold. But she was breathing. She was alive. "You're safe now," Joe said, quickly wrapping her in his heavy fishing jacket. "You're safe." He helped her into the small cabin, cranking up the heater while reaching for his radio. "Mayday, mayday," he called. "Coast Guard Cedar Bay, this is Emily's Grace. I've got a child aboard, pulled from the water off Powell's Point. Need immediate assistance, possible hypothermia." The radio crackled with a quick response. Joe gave their coordinates while studying the girl huddled in his jacket. Her eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but there was something else there too, a deep hurt that had nothing to do with the cold water. "I'm Joe Matthews," he said gently, helping her hold his thermos of coffee. "Can you tell me your name?" Linda," she managed between chattering teeth. Her hands trembled as she tried to drink. "Linda," he repeated softly. "Can you tell me how you ended up in the water?" She looked up at him, tears mixing with the seawater on her face. My dad," she whispered. "He threw me in." The words hit Joe like a physical blow. In 40 years on the water, he'd seen plenty of tragedy, storms, accidents, the cruel randomness of fate. But this was something else entirely. Red and blue lights appeared through the fog, the Coast Guard approaching fast. Joe kept one hand on Linda's shoulder, steadying her as the rescue boat pulled alongside. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Paramedics wrapped Linda in thermal blankets while checking her vitals. Police officers began asking questions, their faces growing grim as the story emerged. "I need to stay with her," Joe insisted, as they prepared to transfer Linda to the Coast Guard vessel. Something in his voice must have convinced them. They nodded, helping both aboard. The ride back to Cedar Bay seemed to take forever, though Joe knew it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Linda stayed close to him, clutching his rough hand like a lifeline. She was starting to shiver violently. A good sign, the paramedic said. It meant her body was fighting back. Harbour lights appeared through the fog, and Joe could see emergency vehicles waiting at the dock, their lights painting the night in urgent colours. As they approached the pier, Linda's grip on his hand tightened. "Don't leave," she whispered, fear making her voice crack. "Please." "I'm not going anywhere," Joe promised, and he meant it with every fibre of his being. Something had happened out there in the dark waters, something more than just a rescue. He'd been given a chance to make a difference, to save a life when he couldn't save his own daughters so many years ago. The dock was crowded now with police, medical personnel, and concerned locals. Cedar Bay was a small town. News travelled fast. Officer Sarah Wilson, who'd known Joe since she was a girl, took his initial statement while paramedics examined Linda. "We'll find him," Sarah promised, her notebook full of details. "We'll find them both." But Joe wasn't thinking about justice yet. He was watching Linda, seeing how she kept looking back at him even as the paramedics worked, making sure he was still there. He thought about Margaret at home, about the room that had stood empty since Emily died, about how sometimes the sea took away and sometimes it gave back. "Mr. Matthews," a paramedic approached. "We need to take her to the hospital now, for observation." Joe nodded, moving to Linda's side. "I'll follow right behind," he told her. "I promise." As the ambulance pulled away from the dock, its siren cutting through the fog, Joe knew with absolute certainty that his life had changed course as surely as if he'd turned his boat into a new wind. Sometimes rescue meant more than just pulling someone from the water. Sometimes it meant becoming the harbour they needed to heal. The first light of dawn found Joe still at the hospital, dozing in an uncomfortable chair while Linda slept. Margaret had arrived hours ago, bringing dry clothes and that quiet strength that had sustained their marriage through its darkest days. "She'll need a place to stay," Margaret said softly, watching the small figure in the hospital bed. It wasn't really a question. They both knew their home, silent for so many years, was about to change. The doctors released Linda the next day, satisfied that the cold hadn't done any lasting damage. The emotional wounds, they warned, would take longer to heal. Joe and Margaret listened carefully to instructions about trauma counselling and warning signs to watch for. Their drive home followed the coastal road, the morning sun sparkling on the water. Linda sat in the back seat, clutching a small bag of belongings the police had collected from her house. She hadn't spoken much since giving her statement, but her eyes stayed fixed on the sea, as if trying to understand how something so familiar had become so threatening. "Here we are," Margaret announced, as they pulled up to their weathered Cape Cod house. "It's not much, but it's home." The spare room was ready, freshened with clean linens and a handmade quilt in shades of blue and green. Margaret had spent the night preparing it, finally opening the door that had remained closed since Emily's death. The room still held echoes of their daughter, but now it offered something new, a chance for healing. "This is your space now," Margaret told Linda, showing her the dresser, the window seat overlooking the harbour, the small desk beneath a shelf of books. "You can make it your own." The first few days established a gentle routine. Morning light would find Margaret in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and toast drawing Linda downstairs. Joe would return from his early fishing run, bringing the scent of salt air with him. They didn't push Linda to talk, letting her find her way in her own time. "Want to learn about lobster traps?" Joe asked one morning, seeing Linda watching him work on the dock. She nodded, stepping carefully onto the weathered planks. Joe showed her how to check the mechanisms, how to bait them properly, how to read the water's mood. "The sea has its own language," he explained, demonstrating how to coil a rope. "Once you learn it, you're never really alone out here." Slowly, Linda began to emerge from her shell. She helped Margaret in her small garden, learning the names of coastal flowers that thrived in the salty air. She accompanied Joe on short fishing trips, staying within sight of shore, each successful return building a new kind of confidence. The town wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Mrs. Chen at the general store always had a piece of saltwater taffy waiting. Old Tom from the bait shop told endless stories about the legendary storms he'd weathered. Even gruff Captain Peters would tip his hat when Linda passed, a gesture of respect for a survivor. The police kept them updated about the search for Mason and Ruth. The couple had disappeared the night of the incident, leaving a trail of unpaid bills and unanswered questions. But Linda seemed to find peace in the distance, in the simple rhythms of life with Joe and Margaret. "You're good with those knots," Joe observed one afternoon, watching her small fingers work the rope with growing confidence. He'd been teaching her the essential sailor's knots, each one a practical lesson in trust and security. "My dad?" Linda started, then stopped, the word catching like a fishbone in her throat. It was the first time she'd mentioned him since that night. "The good memories are still yours to keep," Margaret said gently, setting down her garden tools. "No one can take those away." Linda considered this, her hands still moving with the rope. "But how can I trust those memories now?" "Same way you learn to trust the sea again," Joe answered. "One day at a time, with respect for its power, but not let fear rule you." As spring arrived, bringing warmer winds and longer days, Linda's nightmares began to fade. She still woke sometimes, gasping from dreams of cold water and betrayal, but now there was Margaret's quiet comfort and Joe's steady presence to anchor her back to safety. They celebrated her 9th birthday in April, a small gathering on the beach behind the house. The community came together. Mrs. Chen brought almond cookies, Old Tom supervised a bonfire, and Captain Peters arrived with a hand-carved model boat. "Look there," Joe pointed out as they enjoyed birthday cake. A pod of dolphins played in the harbour mouth, their fins catching the golden light. "Life always finds a way to dance again." Linda smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. It was small, like a shell half buried in sand, but precious in its authenticity. Margaret, watching from her beach chair, wiped tears from her eyes. That evening, as the party wound down and the sun painted the sky in spectacular colours, Linda stood at the water's edge. Joe joined her, noting how she no longer flinched at the waves lapping at her feet. "Joe?" she asked, her voice stronger now than it had been in months. "Can I learn to captain the boat?" He looked down at her, seeing not just the trauma she'd survived but the strength she was building. "I reckon it's time," he said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "We'll start tomorrow." Later, tucked into her bed with Margaret's quilt wrapped around her, Linda listened to the distant sound of waves. The sea that had almost claimed her life was becoming something else now. Not just a source of fear, but a teacher of deeper truths about survival, healing, and the power of new beginnings. Outside her window, the lighthouse beams swept across the harbour in its endless rhythm. But now, instead of marking the site of betrayal, it illuminated the path toward healing. Linda was learning that while some waves might try to pull you under, others would always lift you toward the light. The healing wasn't complete. There were still shadows to face and truths to reconcile. But in the steady love of Joe and Margaret, in the embrace of a community that understood the power of second chances, Linda was finding her way back to trust, back to joy, back to life itself. The sea had taken much from her that November night, but it had also given something precious in return: a new family, a new home, and the knowledge that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, love, and the courage to begin again. Spring turned to summer, and Linda was helping Joe stack lobster traps on the dock when she saw him. A familiar figure standing at the far end of the pier, looking as lost as driftwood in a storm. Her hands froze on the wooden slats. Mason. He was thinner now, his face weathered by months of running. Ruth was nowhere in sight. Joe noticed Linda's sudden stillness and followed her gaze, his body tensing like a storm shield. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, moving to place himself between Linda and her father. The harbour sounds seemed to fade. Gulls' cries, boat engines, fishermen's calls, all dimming to a distant hum. Mason took a hesitant step forward, then stopped when Joe squared his shoulders. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I needed to see her." Linda gripped the back of Joe's jacket, her heart hammering against her ribs. The last time she'd seen her father, he'd been a shadow at the helm of a boat disappearing into fog. Now he looked smaller somehow, broke down by guilt and time. "Ruth left," Mason continued, his eyes fixed on Linda. "The night it happened, took everything and disappeared. I've been getting help, counseling, trying to understand how I could—" "Stop!" Joe's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Whatever you need to say, it needs to be her choice to hear it." Linda felt the warmth of Margaret's presence as she appeared beside them, summoned by some invisible signal. The three of them stood like a wall between Linda and her past. "Linda," Mason's voice cracked on her name, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. What I did, there's no excuse. But I needed you to know how sorry I am, how much I hate myself for what I did." The summer breeze carried the salt smell of low tide, seaweed, and memory. Linda remembered this man teaching her to fish, showing her how to read weather in the clouds, promising to always protect her. Those memories clashed violently with the cold reality of that November night. "Why?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. "Why did you choose her over me?" Mason's face crumpled. "I was weak," he admitted. "Broken inside in ways I didn't understand. Ruth, she got in my head, made me believe things that weren't true. But that's not an excuse. Nothing could excuse what I did to you." The harbour continued its daily business around them, boats coming and going, nets being mended, fish being sorted, life moving forward while this moment stretched like pulled taffy. "I'm sober now," Mason said. 6 months, leading support groups for other parents trying to find their way back. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm trying to be someone different, someone better." Linda felt Joe's steady presence, Margaret's gentle strength. These people who had become her family without asking anything in return. They had shown her what real love looked like, constant, reliable, unconditional. "I have a new family now," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "They saved me, not just from the water, but from what happened after." Mason nodded, tears tracking down his cheeks. "They're good people, better than I was. I'm glad you found them." Margaret stepped forward then, her usual gentle manner backed by steel. "Love isn't a competition," she said firmly. "It's not about better or worse. It's about choices, the ones we make every day to protect or harm those who trust us." The lighthouse stood sentinel in the distance, its white tower a reminder of both tragedy and rescue. Linda looked at her father, really looked at him. She saw the guilt eating him alive, the desperate desire to make amends, the knowledge that some things can't be undone. "I can't," she started, then took a breath. "I can't forget what happened. Not ever." "I know," Mason whispered. "But maybe." Linda felt Joe's encouraging hand on her shoulder. "Maybe we can learn to build something new, something different." Hope flickered across Mason's face like distant lightning. "I'd like that," he said softly. "Whatever you're willing to give, whenever you're ready. I'll wait as long as it takes." Joe cleared his throat. "Any relationship with Linda goes through us," he stated firmly. "She's our daughter now, too." Mason nodded quickly. "Of course, I understand. I'm just grateful for any chance." The afternoon sun painted the harbour in shades of gold and blue. Boats bobbed at their moorings, seabirds wheeled overhead, and the eternal rhythm of waves marked time like a heartbeat. "Would you—" Mason hesitated. "Would it be okay if I came by sometimes? Just to talk?" Linda looked up at Joe and Margaret, drawing strength from their presence. "Maybe," she said, "but not alone. Not yet." "Never alone," Joe affirmed, his voice carrying the weight of promise. As Mason turned to leave, moving slowly like a man carrying a heavy burden, Linda watched him go. The father who had thrown her away and the father who had tried to drown her were both real, both part of her story. But now there was something else too. The possibility, however faint, of redemption. The harbour bells chimed the hour, their sound carrying across the water. Linda turned back to the lobster traps, back to the simple work that had helped heal her. Joe and Margaret resumed their positions beside her, their love as steady as the lighthouse beam. Sometimes, Linda was learning, the hardest storms bring unexpected gifts. And sometimes the journey back from betrayal begins with a single step on a sunlit pier, witnessed by seabirds and fishermen, blessed by those who know that love, real love, is as constant as the tide itself. Summer stretched into autumn, painting Cedar Bay in rich golds and deep reds. Linda stood at the helm of Emily's Grace, her hands sure on the wheel as she guided the boat into harbour. Joe watched proudly from beside her, marvelling at how far she'd come from that terrified child he'd pulled from the waves. Mason had kept his word, visiting each week, always respecting the boundaries set by Joe and Margaret. He would sit on the dock, helping to mend nets or sort catches, sharing careful conversations that built like layers of pearl around a grain of pain. "The support group's growing," he told them one afternoon, his hands working steadily with the nets. "More parents finding their way back. Sometimes when I share my story, I can hardly believe I was that person." Linda listened from her perch on a nearby piling, noting the changes in her father. The haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by something steadier. 9 months sober now, he carried himself differently, like a man rebuilding himself from the foundation up. "I have something to say," Linda announced one crisp October day as they all sat on Joe and Margaret's porch. The lighthouse beams swept across the harbour behind them, marking time like a metronome. Joe set down his coffee mug. Margaret paused in her knitting. Mason's hands stilled on the rope he was splicing. They waited, giving her the space to find her words. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," she began, her voice clear and steady, "about what it really means." The waves lapped at the shore below, their rhythm as ancient as hurt itself. A gull cried overhead, wheeling through the autumn sky. "When you threw me in the water that night," Linda continued, looking directly at Mason, "you broke something I thought could never be fixed. My trust, my sense of safety, my belief in love itself." Mason's face crumpled with pain, but he didn't look away. He owed her this, the courage to face what he'd done. "But Joe taught me something about the sea. Linda said, glancing at the man who'd become her second father. He said sometimes the waves that try to drown you can also teach you how to swim. Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand, offering silent support. I thought forgiveness meant forgetting, Linda continued, or saying what you did was okay. But now I understand it's not about that at all. She took a deep breath. It's about freeing myself from the weight of that night. About choosing who I want to be, not letting what happened define me forever. The porch fell silent except for the distant sound of harbour bells and the soft whisper of waves. I forgive you, Dad, Linda said finally, the words falling like stones into still water. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to this pain is like drowning all over again every day. And I'm ready to swim now. Mason's tears fell freely, tracking down his weathered cheeks. Linda, he whispered, I don't deserve. This isn't about what you deserve, she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. It's about what I need, to heal, to grow, to live without this anchor of anger weighing me down. Joe cleared his throat, emotion making his usual steady voice rough. That's real wisdom there, child. Real wisdom. But I need you to understand something, Linda continued, looking at Mason. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean things go back to how they were before. We have to build something new, something different. Mason nodded, hope and gratitude warring on his face. Anything, he promised. Whatever you need, however long it takes. Margaret stood quietly, returning moments later with her special occasion chocolate cake, the one she'd been saving for just the right moment. As she cut and served pieces, the tension on the porch slowly dissolved into something softer, something healing. You know, Joe said thoughtfully, the sea teaches us that every wave is new. Can't hold on to one or push another away. Just got to learn to navigate them all. Linda smiled, understanding the deeper truth in his words. She looked around at this unlikely family, the fisherman who'd saved her, his wife who'd helped her heal, and the father who'd nearly destroyed her but was now fighting his way back to redemption. The lighthouse beams swept across them, illuminating each face for a moment. Joe's weathered strength, Margaret's gentle wisdom, Mason's hard-won humility, and Linda's own emerging resilience. They were not a conventional family, but they were real and true and healing. As the autumn evening settled around them, bringing with it the first hint of winter's chill, Linda felt something shift inside her, like a boat finding its balance after a storm. Forgiveness, she was learning, wasn't a single moment, but a journey, taken one day at a time, marked by small victories and careful steps forward. The harbour lights began to twinkle on, each one a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow, Linda would help Joe with his lobster traps. She would share breakfast with Margaret, maybe help Mason organise papers for his support group. Simple moments, precious in their normalcy, each one a testament to the healing power of forgiveness. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars her father had once taught her to navigate by, now guiding her toward a different kind of harbour. A place where love could weather any storm, where trust could be rebuilt plank by plank, and where forgiveness could transform the deepest wounds into channels for grace. The sea whispered its ancient wisdom to the shore, and in its endless rhythm it seemed to say what Linda had learned in her heart, that life, like the tide, brings both storms and calm, and our strength lies not in avoiding the waves, but in learning to navigate them with grace, courage, and love. What happened in Cedar Bay that year changed more than just a father and daughter. It taught an entire community about the power of forgiveness and the strength of the human heart to heal. Today, if you visit the small fishing town, you might see Linda at the helm of Emily's Grace, confidently guiding the boat through familiar waters. Joe still stands beside her, but now as a proud mentor rather than a protector. Mason helps at the dock, his quiet presence and steady hands a testament to the hard work of redemption. Margaret's garden blooms with coastal flowers, much like the family that grew from tragedy, unexpected, resilient, and beautiful in its own way. The lighthouse still stands sentinel, its beam sweeping across the harbour each night, reminding all who see it that even in our darkest moments, hope guides us home. The sea that nearly claimed a young girl's life became the very thing that helped her heal. Its constant rhythm taught her that while some waves might try to pull us under, others lift us toward the light. The same waters that witnessed a father's worst moment also saw his journey back to love. Linda's story reminds us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the storms we've weathered. It's about choosing not to let them determine our course. It's about finding the courage to sail forward, even when the memories of past betrayals still echo like distant thunder. In the end, this is more than just a story about a father who made a terrible choice or a fisherman who became a hero. It's about the family we're born with and the family we find. It's about the healing power of community, the strength found in second chances, and the profound truth that love, like the tide itself, can transform even our deepest wounds into channels for grace. As the sun sets over Cedar Bay each evening, painting the water in shades of gold and purple, Linda often stands at the water's edge. Sometimes Joe joins her, or Margaret, or Mason. This unlikely family brought together by tragedy, but bound now by something stronger than blood. The choice to love, the courage to forgive, and the wisdom to know that every day brings a new chance to begin again. What would you do if faced with such a choice? Could you find the strength to forgive like Linda, or the courage to change like Mason? Perhaps your own story of healing is waiting to begin. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of forgiveness and the strength of the human spirit. Remember, sometimes the biggest storms in our lives lead us to the most beautiful shores, and it's never too late for redemption if we're brave enough to take that first step toward healing.